Good to see you again, guys. We're going to be looking through a bit more of cheeky Romans today. So I've got Trev here, and we've also got a bit of a live audience going today. So last week, Trev, you introduced us to the character of the headless. Could you just remind us what that was really about and how that applies to us?
I think what we're to do, Josh, is we're to think of, imagine Paul in his study, and he's looking out, and he's looking at Rome then, and he's trying to think how people think about God, themselves, human nature. And then in Romans 1, he's describing that. Now obviously, the nature that you look at in Romans 1, and a person in Rome back then, if you actually look at it, it's basically a modern Brit today. A person who chooses to ignore God. What do I mean by that? Well, we saw last week that what Paul is saying is that everybody, by nature, knows at least two key things about God. Number one, he's creator, and number two, he's their judge. What they choose to do with that knowledge is three things. They suppress it, they push it down, because they don't want God ruling them. And then what they do, once they press it down, they then exchange it. They exchange God, the truth of God, of who he is, with something else. We thought last week, that we're made in his image, then we make something, so it's a copy of a copy of a copy that people worship. And then once they've done that, then they think they have the right to then change the truth about how they should live. So that's what we thought last week, and then this week Paul is going to introduce to us a new person.
So in what way would he be different to the headless?
What Paul is trying to do, Josh, is he's trying to show that every single person is guilty of rebelling against God. We'll see that in Romans 3:23. All have fallen short of the glory of God. So last week you had the kind of person who ignores God, who is kind of irreligious. We would say the unchurched. For the Jew, it was the Gentile. But really, Paul wants to show that actually the religious are just as guilty. And he wants to go down the hypocrite route to show them that they are by nature hypocrites.
So how does he do that then?
Paul is absolutely brilliant in the way he does it. You see, what he's trying to do, what he knows is, the illustration I used today is that Romans 1 is a very, very dark portrait. And Paul has painted a very dark picture of life without God. Now, what you've got to imagine is the Jew, the self-righteous, the church-going person today who calls himself a Christian. They're sitting there and they're watching Paul paint this dark portrait, and they're agreeing with every word. In fact, they're agreeing with all the dark colours that he's using. They're egging him on. They're absolutely loving it. And Paul kind of wants that response in them. And then what he does is he turns the picture quickly. Now, what they're doing is they're judging people by a right standard, God's law, he says in chapter 2. So they have God's law and they agree with God's law. And then they use God's law to judge the unchurched, the pagan, the person who doesn't know God. Okay, so they have the law and they're judging. And they're agreeing with Paul, they're agreeing with Paul. And then Paul just stops and says, okay, what I want you to do is I want you to use that law on yourselves. In one sense, the illustration I used today is this. They judge them by God's law, but what they never use is a mirror. Judge with the law, but never with a mirror. What do I mean by that? Well, they're judging with God's law, but they never look in the mirror of God's law themselves. Now, what Paul does is he switches that around. He says, you do the same things. Okay, you pass judgment, but you do the same things.
So you describe three particular sins that really apply to that. Can you just remind us about exactly how they fit in and what we can learn about them?
You see, if you read chapter 1, there's a whole list of sins. And some of them are the very dark colours that Paul is painting. But I think what the Jews then, and what some Christians today tend to do, is they cherry pick certain sins, often the sexual sins, and they make them out as if they're the worst. But really there's a whole list of sins. So just take the three that I took. Greed. Now what Paul is saying is, does the law of God teach that greed is wrong? Yes. And then he says, okay, so then what I said to the young people today was, have you ever been hurt by people who have been greedy? Answer, yes. And then Paul says, and have you been greedy? And the answer is yes. We then look to gossip. Okay? So, is gossip wrong? The law says yes. Have you been hurt by gossip? The answer is yes. Do you gossip? The answer is yes. So therefore, you judge with the right standard, but by judging that and using that, you're actually condemning yourselves because you do the same things. And the last one we thought was mercy. Have people been spiteful to you? Yes. Does it hurt? Yes. Have you been spiteful to others? Yes. So that's the kind of line that Paul takes. It's absolutely brilliant, and he uses it to show that actually the Jew then and the church-going person today and others, as we'll maybe see in a minute, are just as guilty, and they're hypocrites.
So something that surprised me a bit in your talk, there seem to be really massive similarities between today's press and people like that and the Pharisees and the Jews back then. Could you just remind us about?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you take the tabloid press, I think Paul would put them in chapter 2. Now, obviously, they're in chapter 1 because they live in a liberal way and their attitude towards sin is just like Romans 1. But they're often just like people in chapter 2 as well. Because what they do is they build up a sin that's wrong. So it might be adultery or immorality or gossip. And they'll really, really make that as if that's wrong. And then, so they'll look at a celeb who's gossiped. They'll look at a celeb who's been unfaithful. And they'll really, really hammer them. And then in another bit of their paper, they'll be telling you to enjoy adultery. They'll be putting a half-naked woman there and saying, look at her and think of all the thoughts you want to think. Now that's a complete, that's hypocrisy. Because in one bit they're saying it's wrong and they're killing and destroying someone's character. Then the next bit, they're actually getting you to enjoy the same sin. So Paul, they're using a good law to show sin, and then they're actually being a complete hypocrite. So the kind of tabloid press and people who read them, and you've got to say, why do we read that? We think something's wrong, yet we enjoy reading about adultery. We think lying's wrong, yet we enjoy reading lies. So we're just like the people in chapter 2.
So if we're in such a dark place, how can we be confident when we eventually receive judgment from God? What are we going to do?
Brilliant question. I mean, what Paul says is two things are revealed. God's anger is revealed in chapter 1, and then God's righteousness is revealed in chapter 2, in verses 16 and 17 in chapter 1. So two things are revealed, God's wrath and God's righteousness. Now, I said at the end today, if you look at chapter 2, verse 16, it talks about all our secrets being judged on the last day of history. And I said, I'm not frightened of that. You can look at all my secrets. I'm happy for every single human being who's ever lived to look at the secrets of Trinity Peace. Why? Because when they look at my secrets, they'll be looking at Jesus' secrets. Because I'm in Christ. I'm covered in his righteousness. My secrets have been judged on the cross. My sins have been judged on the cross. So when God the Father looks at me, he sees Christ because I'm in his righteousness. So all the secrets that I have on the last day of history will be the secrets of Jesus Christ, who lived a perfect life, whose thought life was perfect, whose acts were perfect. So I'm very happy to stand before God. I'm very happy with all my secrets because they're Christ's.
Wow. Well, it's great to end on a high note after hearing all about Paul's incredibly dark picture that he's painted. That wraps up today's installment of Romans 2. Come back next week for even more cheeky remarks.